Howdy, you hear that? The music's different, and that means that we are in random battle number 3 here on A Year of Final Fantasy. And today we're going to be talking about some of the rather interesting enemies that have shown up in the games for quite a long time. Today we'll be talking about the Piscodemons and the Adamantoise. And these are incredibly interesting to nerds all around, as they aren't really creations of Final Fantasy, but of course we've talked about things that aren't creations of Final Fantasy, but let's see what these entail. So the first of which we're going to be talking about is the Piscodemon, and this is an incredibly interesting one because they are essentially mind flayers from Dungeons & Dragons D&D. In fact, in some games they are actually referenced as mind flayers in Final Fantasy, and this brings up some really interesting legal issues that I'll discuss here in a second. First, let's talk about what these Piscodemons or mind flayers or whatever you want to call them really are. Essentially, they're taken from Lovecraftian horror. In the realm of RPGs, they have psychic abilities, and in D&D lore, they feast off of others' brains exclusively. That's their sustenance. They're usually fairly powerful in Final Fantasy terms, as well as D&D. In fact, they're extremely powerful in D&D. And in the Final Fantasy games, they're usually some kind of magic user, while in D&D, they're kind of like the psychic enemies, basically. Now, let's get into the interesting part here. Mind Flayers and Illithids, the proper kind of racial name for these, are copyrighted by D&D, or at least that's what I'm led to believe. There's an issue that gets sticky with this conflicting information. The major Final Fantasy wiki out there states that one general assumption is that so long as the Mind Flayers are not called quote-unquote Illithids, which is a specifically protected term, Wizards of the Coast cannot claim copyright infringement, as the concept of an octopus-faced mind eater comes from still earlier works of Brian Lumley and H.P. Lovecraft, like I talked about. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird. As far as I know, the assumptions here are not correct, or at least not completely correct, as the term Mind Flayer is actually, as far as I know, under copyright law. And why do I say this? Well, my sources are from the company of Paizo, which creates tabletop RPG Pathfinder. Paizo has not, and from their claims, cannot use the term Mind Flayers, specifically that term, and otherwise noted Mind Flayers and Beholders, which do appear in Final Fantasy games as other names, except for the fact that Mind Flayers, like I said, actually appear with that particular name of Mind Flayer. Now, Paizo, on the topic of Mind Flayers, they just cannot use them legally, as Wizards of the Coast, the creators of D&D, own that specific term. And it even goes to show you, Pathfinder is, for those that don't know, it's kind of a mirror of an older edition of D&D, 3.5 D&D, and they basically have every possible thing that they can use in that game that is pretty much 99% all of what D&D has, because they're taken from mythology and stuff like that. However, they cannot and they will not have Mind Flayers in there because they keep saying that these claims are under the copyright of D&D, of Wizards of the Coast, specifically Mind Flayer. That's why we've had no mention of Mind Flayers, and in fact no mention of Beholders as well, which are some of the most iconic enemies in tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, which Pathfinder emulates fairly well, but they do not have these creatures. They don't even have facsimiles of these creatures, not anything like a Piscodemon or whatever you would think that they would try and get away with, but they don't, because they are owned by D&D. Now that's what's strange, because Final Fantasy does use that specific Mind Flayer term. So I've done digging, and I'm just not sure how they get away with it. I'm inclined to believe that that Mind Flayer term is Wizards of the Coast property. So if anyone knows anything about this and can point me to legal evidence, legal documents, then I would love to know that. I don't want to hear, like stories or conjecture or whatever. I want to know in writing if this is or is not copyrighted. So definitely let me know that, and I'll make another video updating this. I actually think about it quite often. And while I do understand that the appearance of the enemy can be used with no problem, because it did come from like H.P. Lovecraft, that kind of Lovecraftian horror, that specific term has always eluded me. But anyway, let's get on to Adamantoise. Like many of a Final Fantasy staple before him, Adamantoise makes his debut appearance in Final Fantasy II as a large turtle boss, and in fact in most of the games the Adamantoise appears usually as a boss form, but sometimes he's just a regular kind of tougher enemy that you encounter later on in the game. In the more recent games though, they appear in these grandiose statures. They're huge monolithic enemies, especially in Final Fantasy 15, because as of this recording, the Adamantoise in Final Fantasy 15 is the super boss of that game, containing 5,624,000 HP. That is a lot of HP. Originally it was hyped up as being the hardest boss ever, taking over 15 real-time hours to kill. Actually, even before that, there was some information rumbling around that it was going to take near 72 hours. I've heard that was a mistranslation, but you know, just to document it, yeah, it was originally said to take 72 hours, but again, that didn't actually pan out. However, right now, if you're equipped with the right weapons and buffs and everything like that, the Adamantoise has been killed in under 10 minutes. But again, regardless, that's incredibly a long time for a single battle. It's very huge. It's quite literally one of the biggest enemies in the entire series. And the actual name, though, let's get to the actual kind of lore of it. The name of the creature comes from a specific word that many comic book readers might know, and that is adamantium. In fact, most people interested in comic books or the movies or anything obviously know this as the fabled metal that makes Wolverine awesome, alongside with his regenerative abilities and his other mutant stuff. But even then, it didn't originate in comics, of course. It has further roots back in the ancient Greek mythology under the names of adamant, adamantium, adamantite, and or adamantine. Essentially, it refers to an extremely hard substance composed of materials like diamonds, maybe some other gemstones, or a combination of gems and metals that just make something incredibly hard. People also referred to it later on in medieval periods as magnetic lodestones. They called those adamant or adamantium, and that actually led to the definition of adamant meaning magnetic, which was apparently derived from the word adamare, meaning admiration, love, and general attachment. That was a misnaming, essentially. Right now, pretty much all of that has gone to the wayside in modern culture. It's usually relegated to myth, comic books, video games, and it no longer actually has any real meaning in the real world as it used to, referring to hard substances, because that word has been supplanted by the actual, you know, scientific names. For instance, like diamond. We would refer to a diamond thing as a diamond, not as an adamant or adamantium material. But hey, now we have super cool metal in all of these fantastic comic book lore and video games and stuff. So it's a word that kind of just completely belongs to the comic book readers, just the general nerd realm here. So that's it for this random battle episode. Hopefully you learned a little bit from these two creatures of Final Fantasy. And please, again, if you know the Mind Flayer answer, let me know, because I am very much interested in it. And yeah, so until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.